The ceiling of the maintenance tunnel shook, dusting Eli's hair with pulverized concrete and rust. Above him, the heavy thrum of atmospheric thrusters vibrated through the planet's crust, a sound like a giant heart beating in a panic. He wiped a smear of grease across his forehead and squinted at the exposed wiring of the comm beacon. It was a mess of fused circuits and charred inputs, much like the rest of the colony. Great, Eli thought, twisting a spanner around a stubborn bolt. Just perfect. The entire sector is being glassed by an empire I have never seen, and I am down here fighting a stripped screw. Another tremor hit, harder this time, knocking a loose pipe against his shoulder. He hissed through his teeth but did not stop working. If he could get the beacon to pulse just once, maybe it would confuse their targeting sensors long enough for the transport ships in the North Quadrant to clear the atmosphere. It was a stupid, desperate hope, the kind that usually got people killed. But it was the only thing he had left. He was a mechanic, not a soldier. His hands were calloused from fusion drives and hydro pumps, not trigger guards. But on a colony world like this, the difference between a mechanic and a corpse was often just a matter of timing. The ventilation grate above him rattled. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light cutting through the gloom. Eli paused. The rhythmic thumping of the dropships had stopped, replaced by the sharp metallic clatter of boots on the overhead grating. They were not human boots. The cadence was wrong, too heavy, too fast. Eli shut off his mag light, plunging the tunnel into darkness. He gripped the heavy wrench in his right hand, his breath held tight in his chest. The hatch at the end of the tunnel blew inward with a concussive force that rattled his teeth. Smoke poured in, acrid and smelling of ozone. Through the haze, figures emerged. They were tall, encased in armor that shimmered like oil on water, shifting colors from deep violet to aggressive crimson as they moved. Their helmets were smooth, featureless domes, and in their hands, they held spears that crackled with blue electricity. Empire troops. Slavers. Eli scrambled back, abandoning the beacon. He slid over a slick patch of coolant, his boots fighting for traction. One of the soldiers lunged, the spear tip searing the air inches from Eli's face. Hey, watch the merchandise, Eli thought frantically, swinging the wrench with all his strength. The heavy tool connected with the soldier's helmet with a satisfying clang, cracking the faceplate. The alien staggered, making a sound like grinding gears. Eli didn't wait to celebrate. He scrambled over a pile of debris, aiming for the secondary access hatch. Two more soldiers dropped from the ceiling vents, cutting off his path. They moved with a fluid, predatory grace that made Eli feel heavy and slow. He feinted left, trying to use a steam pipe as cover. But the lead soldier anticipated the move. The butt of a spear caught him in the diaphragm, driving the air from his lungs. Eli collapsed, gasping, the taste of copper flooding his mouth. He tried to rise, tried to lift the wrench again, but a boot pinned his wrist to the floor. He looked up, his vision swimming. The soldier loomed over him, the shimmering armor reflecting the sparks from the dying comm beacon. The spear tip descended. It didn't pierce him. It touched his neck, and a wave of blue lightning hijacked his nervous system. His world turned white, then silent. The last thing he saw was the ceiling of the tunnel dissolving into a blur of indifferent stars. Consciousness returned in waves of nausea. Eli opened his eyes and immediately wished he hadn't. He was not in the tunnel. He was in a cage, suspended in the center of a vast spherical chamber that smelled of exotic spices and unwashed bodies. The floor of the cage was cold metal, and he wasn't alone. Packed in with him were a dozen other humans, all looking ragged, terrified, and bruised, beyond the bars. The orbital market bustled with a horrifying casualness. It was a kaleidoscope of species. There were tall, spindly creatures with multiple joints in their arms, floating beings that looked like gas clouds contained in glass suits, and hulking reptilians that argued over prices in guttural roars. Holographic price tags floated above the cages, displaying numbers that meant nothing to Eli. "Well," Eli muttered, rubbing the sore spot on his neck. "I always said I wanted to see the galaxy." Next to him, an older man with a bandaged head let out a dry, ragged wheeze. "Be careful what you wish for, kid. This isn't exactly the grand tour." Eli looked at the man. The fear in the stranger's eyes was deep, but there was a spark of grim humor there too. It was the only shield they had left. "At least the view is expensive," Eli quipped, nodding toward the massive viewport that dominated the far wall. Outside, a nebula swirled in colors of bruised purple and gold, a beautiful backdrop for a meat market. "Finally going interstellar. And I didn't even have to buy a ticket." The man snorted, a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Yeah, first-class accommodations." A hush fell over the bustling market, rippling outward from the main entrance. The shouting of the auctioneers died down. The chaotic movement of the crowd slowed, then parted like a tide breaking against a stone. A procession entered. At the front were security drones, sleek and silent, their sensors sweeping the crowd. Behind them walked attendants in livery of deep obsidian and silver. But no one was looking at the guards. They were looking at the woman in the center. She was tall, humanoid, but distinctly alien. Her skin was a pale, luminous gray, marked with faint, glowing lines of bioluminescence that traced delicate patterns across her cheekbones and down her neck. She wore a gown made of living silk, a fabric that seemed to breathe, shifting its hue from midnight blue to soft indigo in response to her movements. Her hair was a cascade of silver that floated slightly, as if immune to gravity. Lady Anera Vile. Beside her walked a male of the same species, Lord Cale Vile. He was striking, with sharp, aristocratic features and the same glowing markings, though his burned with a colder, harsher light. He walked with an air of absolute boredom, checking a data pad as he strolled past cages of sentient beings. Eli gripped the bars of his cage. He had heard stories of the high nobility, the ones who bought worlds the way others bought groceries, but seeing them was different. Lord Cale stopped in front of a cage of hulking, four-armed laborers, tapping a finger against his chin. "Efficient," he said, his voice amplified by a translator that smoothed the alien vowels into flat, imperial standard, but temperamental. "I need obedience, not muscle mass." Lady Anera did not look at the laborers. She turned slowly, her silver eyes scanning the room. They were not bored eyes. They were alert, scanning every face, every shadow. When her gaze landed on the cage of humans, she stopped. Eli felt a strange jolt, distinct from the fear that had been churning in his gut. Her eyes locked onto his. They were startlingly human in their shape, but the irises were like shattered mirrors. There was no cruelty in them. Instead, there was a profound, exhausted sadness that seemed out of place on a face of such unearthly beauty. "What about these?" Cale asked, noticing her pause. He glanced at the humans with a sneer. "Primitives. Soft skin. Low radiation tolerance. They break if you work them past 2 rotations. They are dexterous," Anera said. Her voice was soft, melodic, like wind chiming through glass. "And they are adaptable. The estate needs technicians for the lower levels, does it not?" Cale shrugged, barely looking at Eli. "Cheap labor is cheap labor. Buy the lot, discard the ones that fail." He turned away, already bored. But Anera lingered. She looked at Eli for a second longer than the transaction required. In that brief moment, Eli saw something flicker behind the mirror eyes, a question, or perhaps an apology. Then she turned, the living silk of her dress swirling around her like smoke, and followed her husband. Sold, the auctioneer boomed, slapping a digital seal on the cage bars. Eli slumped against the metal. He had been bought. The concept sat heavy in his stomach, a cold stone of reality. He looked at the older man beside him. "I think I preferred the tunnel," Eli whispered. The transport ship landed on a world that defied physics. House Vale's palace was not built on the ground. It was carved into the side of a colossal obsidian cliff that stretched up into the stratosphere. The atmosphere was thick and humid, smelling of ozone and crushed flowers. But the most disorienting feature was the water. Massive waterfalls cascaded from the cliff peaks, but halfway down, they hit invisible gravity distortions and curved upward, spiraling into the sky in shimmering arcs of liquid diamond. Eli stumbled off the transport, his legs cramping from the long flight. The gravity here was heavier than standard, making his bones ache. He and the other humans were herded into a courtyard paved with stones that hummed faintly underfoot. A team of armored guards moved down the line, carrying metal collars. "Hold still," a guard barked, shoving Eli forward. Eli flinched as the cold metal snapped around his neck. It sealed with a hiss, followed instantly by a sharp, agonizing pinch as microscopic needles engaged with his nervous system. He gasped, his hands flying to his throat, but the metal was smooth, seamless. Attention, assets. A voice boomed. A tall, imposing alien female marched into the courtyard. She was of a different species than the Vales, stocky, with skin like tanned leather and 4 eyes arranged in a semicircle. She wore the uniform of a household overseer. "I am Matron Grix. You are now the property of House Vile. The rules are simple. Obedience brings sustenance. Disobedience brings pain. Silence is mandatory unless you are addressed." She tapped a device on her wrist. Suddenly, every collar in the courtyard flared. Eli's knees buckled. It wasn't just pain, it was a sensation of absolute, crushing dread, a synthetic panic induced directly into his brain. He gasped, clawing at the stone floor, his vision tunneling. It lasted for 3 seconds, but it felt like an hour. "That," Grix said, her voice devoid of sympathy, "was level 1. There are 10 levels. You do not want to experience level 2. Eli retched, spitting bile onto the stones. He looked up, wiping his mouth, and saw them. On a high balcony overlooking the courtyard, Lord Kyle and Lady Anera stood watching the processing. Kyle was smiling faintly, as if admiring a well-oiled machine. But Anera gripped the railing, her knuckles white. As Eli looked up, he saw her flinch when the collars activated, her eyes squeezing shut for a fraction of a second. She looked pained, not disgusted by the slaves, but hurt by their pain. Then the mask slammed back down. She smoothed her dress, turned her back to the courtyard, and walked into the shadows of the palace. Eli was assigned to maintenance. It was the only stroke of luck he had, while others were sent to the mines or the agricultural domes. Eli's background with machines kept him inside the palace walls. His days became a blur of endless, grinding labor. He cleaned fusion vents that burned his fingers. He scrubbed living walls that pulsed and shifted under his brush. He polished the obsidian floors until he could see the hollow reflection of his own face. He learned the layout of the palace. It was a labyrinth of luxury and secrets. He learned to make himself invisible, to keep his head down, to never look a noble in the eye. But he saw her. The first time was during a formal reception. Eli was tasked with holding a tray of crystalline glasses near a side entrance. The hall was filled with galactic dignitaries, beings of light, creatures of rock, diplomats in biosuits. Anera moved through them like a dancer. She spoke a dozen languages, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, complimenting warlords on their attire. She was the perfect political wife, charming, decorative, hollow. But Eli watched her hands, while her face smiled. Her hands were constantly moving, tapping subtle rhythms on her glass, adjusting her shawl, clenched into fists at her sides when no one was looking. The second encounter was different. It was 2 weeks into his captivity. Eli was scrubbing a scuff mark in a quiet corridor in the West Wing. It was late, and the palace was asleep. He heard the rustle of fabric and scrambled to his knees, pressing his forehead to the floor as per protocol. "Rise," a soft voice said. Eli hesitated. The matron had been clear, "Never speak, never interact." I said, "Rise." Eli slowly stood up, keeping his eyes on his boots. Lady Anera stood 3 feet away. She was not wearing her formal gowns. She wore a simple robe of shifting gray, and her hair was loose. She looked tired. "What is your name?" she asked. Eli's heart hammered against his ribs. Slaves didn't have names. They had asset numbers. His was 734. "Answer me," she whispered, stepping closer. The smell of those strange alien flowers wafted from her skin. "Eli," he croaked, his voice rough from disuse. "My name is Eli Bezazit." The collar slammed a jolt of electricity into his neck, not the dread-inducing signal, but a sharp, biting shock, the automatic punishment for speaking without a direct order from a primary master. Eli grunted, clutching his neck, stumbling back. "Stop!" Anera snapped. She wasn't shouting at him. She was shouting at the air. She reached out, her cool fingers brushing the skin above the metal collar. Her touch was electric, sending a shiver through him that had nothing to do with the pain. "Faulty equipment," she hissed, her voice trembling with a sudden fierce anger. "It is too sensitive." She looked at him then, really looked at him. Her silver eyes were swimming with guilt. For a second, the distance between them, the gap between slave and mistress, human and alien, collapsed. "I am sorry. Eli," she whispered. She pulled her hand back as if burned. She stood there for a moment, her chest heaving, then turned and walked away swiftly, leaving Eli standing in the corridor, the ghost of her touch still burning on his neck. The political tension in the palace grew thicker every day, hanging in the air like humidity. Lord Kale's face was everywhere. Holographic banners draped the palace walls, displaying his campaign slogans: efficient labor, galactic harmony, order through strength. He was running for a seat on the High Council, and he was running on a platform of ruthlessness. Eli was serving water at a banquet when the true nature of Kale's ambition became clear. The dining hall was a cavernous space with a ceiling that mimicked the night sky. At the head table, Kyle sat with a group of military generals and scientists in white lab coats. "The resistance in the outer rim is growing." A general grunted, tearing into a piece of raw meat. "Conventional suppression is becoming expensive." "Expenses are temporary," Kyle said smoothly, swirling a glass of nectar. "We are on the verge of a permanent solution." One of the scientists, a thin creature with cybernetic eyes, nodded enthusiastically. "The compliance grid is showing 99% efficacy in simulations. It does not just suppress rebellion. It harmonizes the will. It removes the capacity for dissent at a neural level." Eli froze as he poured water for a guest. A world without dissent. Slaves who didn't even know they were slaves. "Imagine," Kyle continued, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper, "an empire that breathes as one organism. No wars, no strikes, just productivity." Anera sat beside him. She was staring at her plate, her face a mask of porcelain perfection. But Eli saw her grip on her utensil. She was holding it so tightly the metal was bending. As if sensing his gaze, she looked up, across the vast hall, amidst the chatter of monsters plotting the end of free will. Her eyes met Eli's. It was a forbidden line of empathy, acknowledgement. She heard it too. She hated it too. Eli quickly looked away, terrified that Cale would notice the silent exchange. He finished his rounds and retreated to the shadows, his hands shaking. Life in the slave quarters was a grim routine, but humanity and sapience had a way of surviving in the cracks. The mess hall was where the slaves gathered to eat. The food was a gray, gelatinous nutrient paste, occasionally garnished with local delicacies. Eli stared at his plate. A large purple grub was wriggling sluggishly in the gray sludge. "Eat up, human." A four-armed alien named Vrax grunted, sitting opposite him. "That is high-grade protein. It's moving," Eli said, poking the grub with his spoon. "It is fresh," Vrax corrected. Eli sighed and scooped up the grub. "Back home, we usually kill the food before we plate it." "It's considered polite," Vrax laughed. "A barking sound. You humans. So delicate. How did you survive on your Deathworld?" "I am starting to wonder that myself," Eli muttered, closing his eyes and swallowing the grub whole. Despite the chains, there was camaraderie. They shared rumors, traded shifts, and cracked jokes that only the condemned would find funny. But cultural barriers were a minefield. A week later, Eli was cleaning the grand foyer. A guard, a reptilian species Eli hadn't learned the name of yet, dropped a data pad. Instinctively, Eli picked it up. He handed it back, bowing slightly and placing his hand over his heart, a gesture of respect on his home colony. The guard froze. The other servants in the room gasped. The guard stared at Eli, his scales flushing a dark red. Did you just offer me a mating bond?" Eli blinked. "What? No, I was just—" "That gesture," the guard hissed, stepping back in horror. "In my culture, that is a formal request for reproductive union." The room went silent. Then, from the corner, Vrax let out a stifled snort. Eli stood there, mortified. "I apologize. I am very ignorant. I did not mean to propose." The guard snatched the pad and stormed off, muttering about presumptuous mammals. As the tension broke, Eli heard a soft sound from the balcony above. He looked up. Anara was standing there, hidden behind a decorative fern. She had a hand over her mouth, her shoulders shaking. She was laughing. It wasn't the polite, tinkling laugh of the court. It was a genuine, silent convulsion of amusement. She caught Eli's eye. Her face flushed and quickly composed herself, raising a ceremonial fan to hide her smile. Later that day, Eli was checking a maintenance alcove in the greenhouse when he found a small package wrapped in silk. Inside was a tray of food, real fruit, bread, and absolutely nothing that wiggled. There was no note. There didn't need to be. Eli took a bite of the fruit. It tasted like sweet pear and sunshine, and smirked. "Thank you, my lady," he whispered to the empty room. The fragile piece of the domestic routine shattered 2 nights later. A ventilation duct in the east wing had been rattling, and Matron Grix ordered Eli to fix it before Lord Cale returned from his late-night council meetings. Eli crawled into the narrow metal tube, his toolkit clanking against his belt. He shimmied 40 feet in, reaching the junction box. As he worked, voices drifted up through the grate below him. It was Cale's private study. "The timeline has accelerated," Cale's voice said, sharp and angry. "The council wants a live demonstration before the vote." "It is too soon," a mechanical voice replied, the scientist with the cybernetic eyes. "The harmonization beam has only been tested on lower primates." "Then find a better subject pool," Cale snapped. "We have plenty of stock in the dungeons. Use the humans. They are physiologically similar enough to the target demographic, and nobody cares if we burn out a few dozen of them. Eli froze, the screwdriver slipping from his sweaty grip. He caught it just before it hit the grate. Low-priority species, Kale continued. The new batch from the colony raid. They are resilient. Prep them for the test tomorrow night. Tomorrow. Eli's breath hitched. They were going to wipe his mind. They were going to turn him and everyone else from the transport into hollow shells to prove a point. He had to get out. He had to warn Vrax. He had to do something. He scrambled backward, moving too fast. His knee hit a rusted section of the duct. The metal groaned, then shrieked. "Who is there?" Kale shouted. Eli lunged forward, trying to cross the weak spot, but the bolts sheared off. The floor of the duct gave way. He fell. He didn't land in the study. The duct curved, dumping him out a debris chute into the open air. He tumbled through leaves and branches, landing hard on soft, mossy earth. He gasped, winded, scrambling to his feet. He was in a private garden, enclosed by high walls. The air was cool and filled with the light of bioluminescent plants that glowed in shades of neon blue and pink. He wasn't alone. Lady Anera stood in the center of the garden, clearly startled. She was barefoot, wearing a nightgown of sheer, shimmering white. "Eli?" she breathed. Eli stumbled back, clutching his ribs. "My lord." "Kale, he's going to—" "Shh." Anera crossed the distance between them in a heartbeat. She grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "You cannot be here. If the drones see you—" "I heard him," Eli stammered, adrenaline overriding the pain. "The compliance grid. He's going to test it on us, on the humans. Tomorrow." Anera's face went pale. The bioluminescence on her cheeks dimmed to a faint, ghostly gray. "He promised he would wait," she whispered, more to herself than him. "He promised more simulations." She looked at Eli, her eyes wide with fear. "You have to go back to the quarters. If he finds you here, knowing what you know—" Suddenly, a low hum filled the air. A security drone was patrolling the perimeter wall, its searchlight sweeping the garden. "Get down!" Anera hissed. She shoved Eli back into the shadow of a large weeping tree and pressed herself against him, shielding his body with hers. The living fabric of her gown spread out, blending with the white flowers of the tree. Eli held his breath. She was pressed against his chest, her head tucked under his chin. He could feel the rapid beat of her heart, syncing with the terrified rhythm of his own. He smelled the strange flowers on her skin, saw the faint galaxy-like freckles of light dusting her shoulders. For a moment, the terror of the execution awaiting him vanished, replaced by a singular, overwhelming awareness of her. She wasn't an alien noble. She was a terrified woman trying to protect a slave. The drone passed overhead, its light washing over the tree but missing them. The hum faded. Anera pulled back, but she didn't step away. They stood in the dark, inches apart. The tension was electric, a mix of fear, gratitude, and a sudden, dangerous fascination. "Why?" Eli whispered. "Why help me?" Anera looked up at him, her silver eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Because," she said softly, her hand hovering near his chest, "I am the only one who knows that the cage I live in is just as small as yours." She stepped back, the moment breaking like a fever. "Go. The service hatch on the left. It leads to the lower levels. Go, Eli, and do not let them take you to the labs tomorrow." Eli nodded, unable to speak. He turned and ran for the hatch, leaving her standing alone in the glowing garden, the weight of the conspiracy pressing down on them both. "Asset 734, report to the upper levels immediately." The command came through Eli's collar, vibrating against his larynx with a teeth-rattling buzz. He dropped the fusion welder he had been using to repair a waste recycler and wiped his hands on his jumpsuit. It was greasy, stained with coolant and grime, a stark contrast to the pristine halls he was about to enter. Matron Grix stood at the lift entrance, her 4 eyes narrowing in disapproval as she looked him over. "Lady Vale has requested you specifically," Grix spat, as if the words tasted like spoiled meat. "She claims she requires a human perspective on her new botanical acquisitions. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not touch anything unless instructed. And try not to smell like a drain." Eli stepped into the lift, the gravity dampeners lurching in his stomach, a human perspective on plants. It was a thin excuse. He knew it. Grix knew it. And he suspected even the palace AI knew it. The doors slid open to the private arboretum. It was a glass-domed sanctuary suspended over the abyss of the cliffside, unlike the rest of the palace, which was all sharp angles and obsidian. This room was a riot of color. Alien flora writhed and pulsed, vines with bioluminescent veins crawled up the walls, and trees with translucent leaves chimed softly in the artificial breeze. Anera was kneeling by a planter box filled with brown, loamy earth, a rare commodity in a palace made of stone and force fields. She wore a simple tunic of pale green, her silver hair tied back with a length of vine. "You came," she said, not looking up. "I did not have much choice." "My lady," Eli replied, stopping at the edge of the walkway, "the collar ensures my schedule is open." Anera dusted her hands off and stood. She looked at him, her expression unreadable, then gestured to the planter. "I bought these from a trader who claimed they were from Terra. He said they require music to grow. Is that true?" Eli stepped closer. In the dirt sat 3 pathetic-looking tomato plants, wilted and yellowing. "Tomatoes," he said, fighting a smirk. "And no, they do not need music. They need sunlight that is not filtered through a uvula spectrum shield. And they probably need less nitrogen in the soil." Anera frowned, tilting her head. "The trader said they were singing bushes." The trader saw a rich woman coming from a parsec away, Eli said before he could stop himself. The collar gave a warning hum, a low-level threat. Eli winced, bracing for the shock, but Anera raised a hand, and the collar went silent. She had override codes. The realization made Eli's skin prickle. She controlled his pain, or the lack thereof. "You are cynical," Anera said, but there was no malice in her voice. She walked over to a console and adjusted the light spectrum settings. "I have never met a human before the auction. Your species is loud, chaotic. I have been listening to intercepts of Earth broadcasts." "Why?" Eli asked. She looked at him, her silver eyes reflecting the dying tomato plants. "Because it sounds like freedom. It sounds messy." She tapped a button, and a jarring, discordant noise filled the air. It was a recording of a thrash metal band, distorted by light years of transmission. "Is this a mating call?" she asked seriously. Eli laughed. He couldn't help it. The sound echoed in the glass dome, harsh and jagged compared to the polite chimes of the alien trees. "No," he said, shaking his head. "That is just people screaming because they can. It is called metal. It is for when you are angry." Anera listened for a moment, her head cocked. Then, a small, genuine smile broke across her face. It wasn't the practiced porcelain smile she wore for Kale. It was real. It crinkled the corners of her eyes and made the bioluminescent freckles on her cheeks flare brighter. "I think I like it," she admitted. "It feels honest." For the next hour, the dynamic shifted. It wasn't mistress and slave. It was two people in a greenhouse talking about the absurdity of the universe. Eli explained the concept of a sandwich. Anera explained that the purple vines in the corner were carnivorous and liked to eat insects that landed on them. But beneath the banter, Eli saw the cracks in her gilded life. While they worked, Eli repotting the tomatoes, Anera pruning a singing tree, she spoke in half-truths that painted a grim picture. Lord Kale is very particular about order, she said, cutting a branch with a little too much force. Our union was arranged by the High Council before I had completed my first molting cycle. House Vale needed the legitimacy of my family's bloodline, and my family needed Kale's military contracts. So you were sold too, Eli said quietly, just for a higher price. Anera froze. The shears hovered over a branch. She looked at him, her gaze sharp and dangerous. Do not mistake my cage for yours. Eli, you wear iron. I wear expectations. If I leave, I lose my status. If I defy him openly, the people I protect, my family, my staff, the populations on my dowry worlds, they suffer. Kyle does not punish individuals. He punishes lineages. She turned away, staring out the glass dome at the waterfalls spiraling upward into the sky. There are cameras in my quarters, she whispered, sensors in my jewelry. The palace AI logs my heart rate, my sleep cycles, my conversations. I am the mistress of this house, and I cannot walk down a hallway without 3 algorithms analyzing my gait. She looked back at him, and the vulnerability was stark. That is why I bring you here, she said, because the humidity in this room disrupts the audio sensors. It is the only place I can hear myself think. Eli looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the exhaustion behind the beauty. She was a bird in a glass box singing for her supper while the cat watched from the shadows. He didn't know what to say. He was a mechanic from a dirtball colony. He couldn't fix politics. So, he said, gesturing to the tomatoes, if you want these to survive, we need to find some manure. And knowing this palace, there is plenty of it walking around in expensive robes upstairs. Anera stared at him for a second, stunned. Then she threw her head back and laughed, a loud, clear sound that drowned out the dying metal music. The intimacy of the greenhouse was a bubble, and bubbles in House Vale were destined to pop. 3 nights later, a grand reception was held to celebrate Kale's rising poll numbers. The great hall was packed with the elite of the sector. Eli was on duty, circling the room with a heavy tray of crystalline platters filled with delicacies. The air smelled of expensive perfume and ozone. Kyle stood at the head of the room, holding court. He looked magnificent and terrifying, his arm draped possessively around Anera's waist. She looked radiant, smiling and nodding, playing the part perfectly. Eli tried to keep his distance, but the room was crowded. A drunken dignitary, a large, gelatinous being with multiple eye stalks, bumped into him. Watch it, filth. The dignitary burped. Eli stumbled. The tray tipped. He managed to save the food, but one of the crystalline platters slid off and shattered against the obsidian floor. The sound was like a gunshot. The room went silent. Eli dropped to his knees to clean it up, his heart hammering. As he reached for a large shard, his hand slipped. The razor-sharp crystal sliced deep into his palm. Blood welled up, bright red and hot. It dripped onto the floor, and instantly, a hidden sensor grid embedded in the stones flared red. Biological contaminant detected. A computerized voice boomed. Unregistered DNA sequence. Security drones detached from the ceiling, their weapons charging. The crowd gasped, backing away as if Eli were radioactive. Kyle turned, his eyes narrowing in disgust. Get that mess out of here before it stains the floor. Anera moved before the guards did. I will handle it, she announced, her voice cutting through the tension. She swept forward, the crowd parting for her. She grabbed Eli by his uninjured arm, her grip iron hard. Come. She dragged him not toward the slave quarters, but into a small, velvet-curtained alcove used for private conversations. She tapped a panel on the wall, jamming the door shut. Show me, she ordered. Eli held out his hand. The cut was deep, crossing his lifeline. Blood dripped steadily onto the expensive carpet. Anera didn't flinch. She pulled a small silver device from a hidden pocket in her dress, a dermal knitter. She took his hand in hers. Her skin was cool, smooth, and dry. His was rough, calloused, and slick with blood. The contrast was shocking. As she activated the device, a soft blue light sealed the wound, knitting the skin back together. She didn't let go when it was done. She held his hand, her thumb brushing over the fresh scar, wiping away a smear of blood. You are reckless, she whispered, not looking at his face. I tripped, Eli said, his voice hoarse. You are always tripping, she murmured. Into trouble, into my garden, into my head. She looked up. They were standing inches apart in the dim red light of the alcove. The sounds of the party outside were muffled. The air between them suddenly felt heavy, charged with a static that had nothing to do with the electronics. Eli looked at her lips. They were pale violet, parted slightly. He felt a pull, a magnetic force that defied the survival instinct screaming in his brain. She was his owner. She was the wife of a monster, and she was holding his hand like it was the most precious thing in the room. Anera's breath hitched. She leaned in, just a fraction. Her eyes searched his, terrified and hungry. Then the spell broke. She dropped his hand as if it were hot iron. She stepped back, smoothing her dress, her cheeks glowing a faint, flustered pink. Forget this happened, she commanded, her voice shaking. Go back to the quarters. Do not speak of this. She turned and unlocked the door, stepping back out into the light and noise, leaving Eli alone in the dark, his hand still tingling where she had touched him. The palace was a beautiful machine, but it ran on blood. Whispers began to circulate in the slave barracks. People were disappearing and not just sold, but vanishing. Vrax, the four-armed laborer, told Eli that 3 humans from the maintenance crew had gone to the medical wing for routine inoculations and never came back. Transferred, the guards said. Liquidated, the rumors said. Eli kept his head down, but his ears open. He was invisible again, a piece of furniture with a pulse. He was polishing the base of a statue near the strategy room when he heard Kale arguing with the lead scientist. Dr. Zal, the council is impatient, Kale snapped. The vote is in 2 weeks. They want the compliance grid operational on a planetary scale. It is risky, Zal replied, his mechanical voice grating. We are seeing anomalies in the human test subjects. Anomalies, resistance, their neural pathways are chaotic. They fight the harmonization signal. We have had to increase the voltage to lethal levels to get compliance. Eli stopped polishing. His reflection in the black stone stared back at him, wide-eyed. Humans were resistant. That was why they were being targeted. Their stubbornness, their chaotic minds, the very thing Anera had called freedom, was a glitch in the Empire's software. Burn them out if you have to, Kale said coldly. I do not care if they drool, as long as they obey. The tension was suffocating, so the moments of levity became essential for survival. Eli was assigned to a cleaning crew in the grand bathing hall, a massive chamber of steaming pools and scented mists. He was scrubbing the tiles alongside a diverse group of slaves. A reptilian servant named Sissix nudged him. Look at you, human, standing so still. If we painted you gold, you could pass for a decorative statue. Then you could spy on the nobles while they scrubbed their scales. Eli snorted, dipping his brush in the soapy water. I don't think I want to see Lord Kale scrubbing anything. Thanks. That is a nightmare I do not need. Just then, a high-ranking guest, a cephalopod-like being with a mass of tentacles for a face, emerged from a steam room. He dropped a towel. Eli, trying to be helpful, rushed forward to pick it up. As he handed it back, he tried to use a respectful phrase he had heard the guards use. Your tentacles are very symmetric today, my lord. The room went dead silent. Sissix dropped his brush. The guest turned a shade of deep purple. Symmetric, he gurgled, his tentacles writhing in offense. You insult my asymmetry? In my culture, symmetry is a sign of genetic defects. You are calling me an inbred mutant. Eli froze. Oh, I meant dynamic? The guest swelled with rage, preparing to summon a guard. Suddenly, a cough echoed from the balcony above. Anera was walking along the upper walkway, flanked by 2 attendants. She had stopped, her hand pressed firmly over her mouth. She was shaking. She is laughing, Sissix whispered in horror. She is laughing at the High Minister's tentacles. Anera quickly opened a ceremonial fan, hiding her face, but Eli could see her eyes crinkling. She composed herself enough to call down. Minister, please forgive the human, she called out, her voice straining to remain steady. He is simple. He likely mistook your majestic asymmetry for artistic perfection. The minister huffed, his color returning to a calm blue. Well, yes. I suppose a primitive mind could make such a mistake. He waddled off. Anera glanced down at Eli. She lowered the fan just enough for him to see her grin, a conspiratorial, mischievous expression that made his chest ache. She winked once, then continued her walk. The laughter was a shield, but the reality was a sword. 2 days later, Eli was back in the maintenance tunnels. He had found a dead zone in the sensors near the central data core, a place where he could sit and think without the constant hum of the palace monitoring him. He was fixing a loose wire when he saw movement through a grate that looked into a sub-basement server room. It was Anera. She wasn't wearing her silks. She was dressed in dark, form-fitting tactical gear. She moved with a lethal grace he had never seen before. She approached a secure terminal, bypassed the biometric lock with a device she pulled from her boot, and slotted a data chip into the drive. She wasn't stealing data. She was uploading a virus. Eli watched as screens flickered and died. Then, she pulled the chip out, threw it on the floor and crushed it under her heel. She tapped her ear, activating a comms link. Package delivered, she said, her voice cold and precise. The supply manifest for the harmonization project has been corrupted. It will buy us 3 days before they can reroute the shipment. A pause. No, she said. Kale suspects nothing. He is too arrogant to believe his trophy wife knows how to code. But the timeline is tightening. We need to move the extraction up. She ended the call. Eli sat back in the dark, his mind racing. She wasn't just sympathetic. She wasn't just a sad wife. She was a saboteur. She was fighting the same war he was, right under the nose of the enemy. He shifted his weight, and his boot scraped against the metal of the tunnel. Anera spun around. She didn't gasp. She didn't panic. She drew a small, sleek energy pistol from her belt and aimed it directly at the grate. Come out, she commanded. Eli hesitated. Now! He kicked the grate open and dropped into the room, raising his hands. It is me. It is just me. Anera didn't lower the gun. Her eyes were hard, calculating. You. Again. You have a habit of being where you should not be. Eli. I like the quiet, he said, eyeing the weapon. How much did you see? Enough, Eli said. You are deleting their supply lines. You are slowing down the project. Anera stepped closer, the gun unwavering. And who will you tell? A reward for a loyal slave? Freedom for information? Eli felt a flash of anger. He lowered his hands slowly. You think I would sell you out, after everything? I think survival makes people do terrible things, Anera said, her voice wavering slightly. Kale is a monster, Eli said, stepping toward the gun. He enslaved me. He plans to lobotomize my species. You think I would help him? Anera stared at him, searching his face for deception. Slowly, she lowered the weapon. She let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for years. I cannot trust anyone, she whispered. Not here. You can trust me, Eli said. Why? Because I hate this place as much as you do. The air in the server room grew heavy. Anera holstered the gun and stepped into his space. She grabbed the collar around his neck, her fingers digging into the metal. You hate it? She hissed, her eyes burning with intensity. You wear the chains. Eli. But I live in the forge. Every meal I eat, every dress I wear is bought with the suffering of your people. Do you know what that feels like? To sleep next to the architect of a genocide and have to smile? She yanked on the collar, pulling his face down to hers. I hate this, she said, her voice breaking. I hate this collar more than you do because I put it on you. I signed the order. I am complicit. Eli looked into her eyes and saw the raw, bleeding wound of her conscience. He reached up, covering her hand with his. He didn't pull her hand away. He pressed it closer to the metal. Then help me take it off, he said. The alliance was formed in shadows, but it was sealed in the light of the greenhouse. They met the next night, under the cover of a simulated storm. Rain lashed against the glass dome, masking their voices. They stood by the workbench, a holographic map of the palace projected between them. I have access to the maintenance subgrid, Eli said, pointing to a series of red lines. If I can bridge these two junctions, I can create a feedback loop in the security sensors. It would blind the internal scanners for 10 minutes. 10 minutes is not enough, Anera said, tracing a path through the upper levels. The compliance lab is 3 levels down. We need at least 20 to plant the charges and get out. They worked together, their minds meshing as easily as their banter had. Eli brought the technical grit. Anera brought the strategic overview. They were two halves of a key. As they argued over extraction points, the distance between them vanished. They were leaning over the table, shoulders touching. Eli looked at her. In the blue light of the hologram, she looked fierce, beautiful and terrifying. You are good at this, he murmured. I had to be, she said, looking up. It was either learn to fight back or let myself fade away. She turned to face him. They were alone in the storm-lashed glass bubble. The map flickered and died, leaving them in the dark, illuminated only by the lightning outside and the faint glow of the plants. The silence stretched, heavy and sweet. Eli watched the pulse of light on her neck. He saw the way her lips parted. The collar hummed faintly, a reminder of the barrier between them. But in that moment, it felt irrelevant. Anera took a step closer. She reached up, her hand hovering near his face. She didn't touch the collar this time. She touched his cheek, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. Eli, she whispered. He leaned into her touch. His heart was pounding so hard he thought it would crack a rib. He tilted his head, his forehead resting against hers. Anera, he breathed. Their faces tilted. Her eyes drifted shut. Her breath was warm against his lips, smelling of sweet nectar. He could feel the heat radiating from her body, the living silk of her dress brushing against his jumpsuit. He started to close the gap, just an inch, just a movement of air. Whoop, whoop, whoop. The klaxon screamed through the palace, shattering the world. Red emergency lights began to stroke through the greenhouse. Alert. The AI boomed. Containment breach in Sector 4. Asset escape in progress. Lockdown initiated. Anera flinched back as if she had been slapped. She stared at Eli, her eyes wide, the pupil blown with shock. The moment was gone. The reality of the Empire crashed back in. "Go!" she cried, her voice shaking with panic. "Get back to the quarters. If they find you here during a lockdown, they will execute you on sight." Eli stumbled back, dazed. He looked at her one last time, disheveled, terrified, and beautiful in the red flashing light. "Go!" she screamed. He turned and ran, sprinting out of the sanctuary back into the cold, hard belly of the beast. But as he ran, his lips still burned with the ghost of the kiss that never happened. The transfer of ownership was a bureaucratic quietness that masked a seismic shift in Eli's reality. It happened in Anera's private study, a room lined with data crystals that hummed with the history of House Vael. Anera stood behind her desk, her fingers flying across a holographic interface. Eli stood on the other side, his hands clasped behind his back, waiting. "Done," Anera said, her voice tight. "I have reclassified you. In the main system, you are now designated as a high-security risk due to your technical skills." Eli raised an eyebrow. "That sounds worse. It is necessary," Anera replied, not looking up. "It justifies removing you from the general slave pool and placing your control collar under my exclusive biometric key. Matron Grix can no longer punish you. The palace AI can no longer issue automatic corrections. Only I can activate the pain sequence." She pressed a final command. The collar around Eli's neck let out a soft, descending chime. The constant low-level buzz that had vibrated against his spine for weeks, a subtle frequency designed to induce anxiety and submission, vanished. The silence that followed was deafening. Eli rolled his shoulders, the phantom weight of the signal lifting. For the first time since the auction block, his head felt clear. "Thank you," he said, and the words felt inadequate. "Do not thank me," Anera said sharply. She walked around the desk, stopping inches from him. "I have not freed you. Eli, I have just changed the hand holding the leash. If you run, I will still be the one forced to stop you. I am not running," Eli said. "We have work to do." They did. The alliance they had forged in the greenhouse began to take shape, a structure built of stolen moments and coded whispers. They fell into a rhythm. By day, Eli was the silent shadow, moving through the palace's circulatory system of ducts and maintenance shafts. By night, Anera was the architect, manipulating the social calendar of the high nobility to create blind spots in the security grid. It was a dangerous dance, but it gave Eli a purpose. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was hunting. The hunt led him deep into the underpalace 3 nights later. Using a stolen keycard Anera had swiped from a drunken guard, Eli accessed the sub-levels. He was dressed in the gray, shapeless jumpsuit of a sanitation drone, a cap pulled low over his eyes. He carried a bucket of solvent, the universal passport for invisibility. No one looked at the cleaner. The air down here was different. It was sterile, recycled, and smelled faintly of copper and burnt sugar. The walls were white, a stark contrast to the obsidian luxury above. Eli kept his head down, pushing his cart past labs where scientists in clean suits argued over data pads. He reached the observation deck of Sector 4, the area Kyle had mentioned in his secret meeting. He pressed himself into a maintenance alcove and peered through the heavy glass. The room beyond was a cavernous surgical theater. In the center stood a chair that looked more like a torture device, surrounded by banks of machinery that pulsed with a sickening, oily green light. Strapped into the chair was a human. Eli's breath hitched. He didn't recognize the man. He was older, with graying hair and the ragged look of a miner, but he was human. He was terrified, straining against the restraints, his mouth moving in silent pleas. A technician adjusted a massive circular emitter positioned over the man's head. Harmonization sequence alpha, a voice announced over the intercom. Commencing neural override. The emitter hummed. A beam of pale light washed over the man. He didn't scream. Not at first. Eli watched, his knuckles white as he gripped the handle of his mop. The man's struggling ceased instantly. His body went rigid, then slack. His eyes, wide with terror a moment ago, rolled back, then snapped forward, but they were empty. The spark of fear, of life, was gone. Then came the sound. It wasn't a scream of pain. It was a scream of existential violation. The man opened his mouth and let out a high, keening wail that sounded like a radio frequency being torn apart. It was the sound of a mind being erased, of memories and selfhood being sanded down into nothingness. Subject is harmonized, the technician said. Bored. Response is within acceptable parameters. Wipe him and prep the next one. Eli stumbled back from the glass. Bile rose in his throat. He fumbled with his pocket, his fingers shaking so hard he almost dropped the data spike Anera had given him. He had to get the data. He had to prove this was happening. He spotted a localized server port near the door. He jammed the spike in, watching the progress bar fill with agonizing slowness. 90%. The door to the lab hissed open. 2 guards stepped out, chatting about a card game. Eli yanked the spike out at 98% and threw himself behind his cleaning cart. Hey, one guard said, pausing. Did you hear something? Just the pipes. The other replied, this place is held together by rust and optimism. They walked past him. Eli waited until their footsteps faded, then grabbed his bucket and ran. He didn't walk. He didn't care about cover. He sprinted for the service elevator, the sound of that soulless wail echoing in his skull. He made it to the greenhouse before he fell apart. Anera was waiting for him, pacing by the singing trees. When the doors slid open and Eli stumbled in, stripping off the sanitation cap and gasping for air, she knew immediately that it had gone wrong. Eli? She rushed to him. He collapsed onto a stone bench, burying his face in his hands. His entire body was vibrating. I saw it, he choked out. I saw what they do. Anera knelt before him, her hands hovering, unsure if she should touch him. What happened? They don't just control you, Eli whispered, looking up at her with haunted eyes. The collar. The collar is just a leash. This machine, it hollows you out. It eats you. I watched a man turn into a piece of furniture. Anera. He looked at me, and there was no one home. He slammed his fist against his knee. I ran. I got the data, but I ran. I left him there in that chair. Eli, you could not have saved him, Anera said firmly, grabbing his wrists. I should have tried. I am alive because you bought me, because I am lucky, and he is down there having his soul scraped out. He tried to pull away, shame burning through him. He felt dirty, complicit. He was playing spy games in a palace while his people were being erased. Look at me, Anera commanded. She didn't use the collar. She used her voice, stripped of all noble pretense. She rolled up the sleeves of her silk tunic. Look. Eli stopped struggling. He looked at her arms. Her skin, usually a flawless luminescent gray, was marred. Running from her wrists up to her elbows were thin, jagged lines. They glowed with a frantic, broken light, brighter and harsher than her natural bioluminescence. They looked like cracks in a porcelain vase that had been glued back together. "What?" Eli whispered. "Nerve whip," Anera said softly. "From my father, before Kale, for refusing a betrothal to a warlord twice my age." She turned her arm over, exposing the tender skin of her inner wrist. "I learned obedience the hard way. Eli, I survived just like you. There is no shame in surviving. The shame belongs to the ones holding the whip." She looked at him, her silver eyes swimming with a fierce, shared pain. "We are both broken things, Eli, but we are still here." The space between them seemed to collapse. The horror of the lab, the guilt, the fear, it all funneled into a desperate need for connection, for something real to hold on to in a world that wanted to turn them into ghosts. Eli reached out. His hand trembled as he brushed a strand of silver hair behind her ear. His fingers grazed her cheek, feeling the warmth of her skin, the pulse of life beneath it. Anera leaned into his touch. She let out a shuddering breath and closed her eyes. "You are not alone," she whispered. "I know," Eli said. He didn't think. He didn't calculate the risk. He just moved. He leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate. It was a collision of fear and longing, a silent scream of defiance against the palace, the empire, and the stars themselves. Anera gasped against his mouth, then made a small, wounded sound and gripped the front of his jumpsuit, pulling him closer. Her hands were cool, his were hot, and the contrast sent a shockwave through him. For a moment, the greenhouse vanished, the lab vanished. There was only the taste of her, sweet and strange, and the feeling of her heart beating frantically against his chest. It was dangerous. It was terrifying. And it was the only thing that made sense. They clung to each other, seeking shelter in the storm. Eli's hands tangled in her hair. Anera's arms wound around his neck, holding him as if he were the anchor keeping her from drifting into space. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathless. Their foreheads rested against each other. The silence in the greenhouse was heavy, thick with the magnitude of what they had just done. "We cannot do that again," Anera whispered, her voice trembling. "No," Eli agreed, his eyes closed. "Never." But his hand was still on her waist, and hers was still gripping his collar, and neither of them moved an inch. They buried the moment, deep under layers of sarcasm and planning. But it was there. It was a live wire running between them, humming every time they entered a room together. To maintain their cover, Anera had to treat him like a prize pet. 2 days later, at a public dedication ceremony for a new gravity waterfall, Anera brought Eli along. He was dressed in a ridiculous ceremonial livery, velvet and gold braid that scratched his neck. "My Lady Vael," a visiting duke boomed, "I hear you have acquired a human who can read." "He is quite clever," Anera said, her voice dripping with artificial pride. "He has memorized the lineage of the High Council. Eli, recite the full title of Grand Duke Petui." Eli stepped forward, bowing deeply. "Grand Duke Petui," Eli said, keeping his face perfectly straight. "Lord of the wetlands, keeper of the spittle, and High Master of the Great Expectoration." The court went silent. The name was actually Petui, but Eli had pronounced it with a distinct wet emphasis that sounded exactly like someone spitting on the floor. The Duke blinked. His title is quite evocative when spoken by a primitive tongue. Behind her fan, Anera made a sound that might have been a cough. Her shoulders shook. She turned away, pretending to admire a statue, but Eli saw the tears of suppressed laughter in her eyes. She looked back at him, her eyes dancing. "Very good," Eli, you may retire to the corner. As he walked past her, she whispered, barely moving her lips. You are going to get us both executed. At least we will die laughing, he whispered back. It was a small victory, a secret joke that belonged only to them. In a world of mind control and nerve whips, making the nobility look ridiculous felt like an act of war. But the war was escalating faster than they could joke about. The following evening, Anera stormed into the greenhouse. She didn't greet him. She didn't check for bugs. She marched straight to the workbench and swept a row of clay pots onto the floor. They shattered. They moved the test site, she said, her voice shaking with rage. Eli looked up from a schematic. What? The demonstration? Cale just received the update. The council wants the field test conducted here. In the palace. In the Great Hall. When? Eli asked, standing up. 3 days. That gives us time, Eli said. We can... There is more. Anera cut him off. She turned to him, and her face was a mask of horror. They are bringing in a specific batch of subjects. Survivors from the colony of Hestia Prime. Eli felt the blood drain from his face. Hestia Prime, his home, the mechanic from the transport, the woman who sold bread near the spaceport, the kids who played kickball in the crater. They are bringing my people here, Eli whispered. Anera nodded. To prove that even the most stubborn species can be broken, Cale wants to make an example of them. He wants to break your family to secure his promotion. Eli stood there, frozen. The abstract horror of the lab was gone. This was personal. This was his neighbors, his friends. I have to stop it, he said, his voice low and dangerous. I have to kill him. Eli, no, I have to kill him, Eli shouted, the rage finally boiling over. I am done playing spy. Anera, I am done fixing his vents and bowing to his friends. He is going to wipe the minds of everyone I ever knew. He paced the room, wild-eyed. I will find a plasma cutter. I will walk into his bedroom tonight and I will... The collar slammed him. It wasn't a full shock. It was a warning pulse, triggered by the spike in his adrenaline and aggression levels. Even with the lower settings, the safety protocols were hardwired. Eli gasped, clutching his neck, falling to one knee. Anera rushed to him, entering the override code on her wrist. The pulsing stopped. I am sorry, she said, reaching for him. It reacted to your heart rate. Eli slapped her hand away. He stood up, backing away from her. The anger hadn't vanished. It had turned cold and sharp, directed at the metal ring around his throat. Do not touch me, he said. Eli. You own this, he said, pointing at the collar. You say we are allies. You say we are in this together, but at the end of the day, you have the remote control. You command my body. He looked at her, his eyes blazing with hurt. How am I supposed to know what is real, that kiss? Did you order me to want it? Am I just another asset you are managing? Anera recoiled as if he had struck her. Her face went pale, the bioluminescence fading to gray. You think she whispered. You think I would force that? I don't know, Eli shouted. That is the point. I am a slave. Anera! I have no choice. Everything I do, everything I say, happens because you allow it. How can there be trust when you hold the leash? Anera stared at him. The silence stretched, painful and taut. She looked down at her hands, the hands of a noble, the hands that had typed the code to take control of him. You are right, she said quietly. She reached into the sash of her tunic. Eli braced himself, expecting a punishment tool. Instead, she pulled out a small, flat disc made of matte black metal. She held it out to him. What is this? Eli asked. It is a signal jammer, she said. It operates on a localized frequency. If you press it against the receiver node on your collar, it will sever the connection to the palace mainframe. It will block my override codes. It will block the pain sensors. She walked forward and placed it in his hand. Her fingers were trembling. It will only last for an hour before the battery dies, she said. But for that hour, you are off the grid. No one controls you, not Kale, not the AI, not me. Eli looked at the small device. It was heavy for its size. Why give me this? He asked. Because you need to know, Anera said, her voice thick with emotion. You need to know that what happens between us is real. She stepped back, leaving him with the choice. If you use it, you can run. You can try to kill Kale, though his guards will cut you down before you reach the door. Or you can walk away from me. Eli looked at the device. He looked at the woman standing in the center of the greenhouse, the woman who risked treason every day, the woman with the cracked porcelain scars. He raised the disc and pressed it against the back of his neck. There was a faint click, followed by a total, profound silence. The collar went dead. It was just a piece of cold metal now. No hum, no connection. Eli took a deep breath. He was free. For an hour, he was free. He looked at the door. He could run. He could try to find a weapon. He looked at Anera. She was watching him, her arms wrapped around herself, waiting for him to leave. Eli dropped the jammer into his pocket. He walked across the room. He didn't run. He walked with the steady, deliberate pace of a free man making a choice. He stopped in front of her. I am not going anywhere, he said. Anera let out a sob. Eli reached out and took her face in his hands. This time, there was no hesitation, no fear of the collar reacting. I am staying, he said, fierce and low. Not because you own me, but because I want to be here with you. He kissed her. It was different from the first time. The first kiss had been desperate. This one was a promise. It was slow, deliberate, and devastatingly tender. It was a seal on a contract that had nothing to do with ownership laws. Anera melted into him, her hands gripping his arms, her tears wetting his face. She held him not like a possession, but like a lifeline. Thank you, she whispered against his lips. We are going to stop them, Eli said, pulling back to look at her. My people, your soul, we are going to save them both. How? Anera asked, wiping her eyes. I have an idea, Eli said, a dark, determined look crossing his face. But we are going to need to break a lot more than just a few flower pots. The plan came together in the final hours before the demonstration. Anera received a heavily encrypted transmission from her contact in the Resistance. It was short. During the harmonization broadcast, the central data stream will be open for receiving calibration metrics. It is a two-way street. If you can inject a signal, it will ride the carrier wave to every screen in the sector. It was a suicide mission. They had to be in the room. They had to trigger the disruption manually. On the eve of the demonstration, Eli and Anera stood on the balcony of her private chambers. The gravity waterfalls shimmered in the distance, silver threads against the night sky. Below them, the city sprawled out, a grid of lights that looked beautiful from a distance but dissolved into surveillance nodes and checkpoints up close. It looks like a net, Eli said, leaning on the railing, a golden net thrown over the world. Anera stood beside him. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlaced with his, tight and sure. Tomorrow, we cut the strings, she said. Eli squeezed her hand. He looked at her profile, the noble nose, the sad mouth, the glowing starlight on her skin. If we do this, he said, there is no going back. Even if we win, House Vile falls. You lose everything. Anera looked out at the city. I have nothing to lose that matters, she said. She turned to him. I have already found the only thing I want to keep. She squeezed his hand tighter. Eli looked back at the city lights. He felt the cold metal of the jammer in his pocket and the warm skin of Anera's hand in his palm. He was a slave about to take on an empire. He was a mechanic about to break the biggest machine in the galaxy. Ready? Anera asked. Eli smiled, a sharp, dangerous smile. Let's go break some stuff. The palace was no longer a home. It was a fortress dressed in drag. House Vale had transformed overnight. The usual serene hum of the gravestone halls was replaced by the frantic energy of preparation. Banners of deep crimson and silver hung from every archway, emblazoned with the Vale crest and the slogan for the upcoming demonstration. Harmony is peace. Security had doubled, tripled. Armored drones hovered in the upper vaulted ceilings like angry wasps, their sensors sweeping the crowds of arriving dignitaries. The political elite of the empire flooded through the obsidian gates, a tide of silk, jewels, and arrogance. They came from the core worlds and the outer rim, eager to see the technology that promised to end all resistance and secure their power forever. Eli moved through them like a ghost. He wore his dress livery, the stiff gold-braided collar scratching against his neck, and carried a tray of spiced nectar. He had become an expert at making himself invisible. He kept his eyes lowered, his steps silent, and his posture subservient. To the nobles, he was not a man, he was a mobile table. Excuse me, creature, a tall avian diplomat snapped, snatching a glass from Eli's tray without looking at him. Eli bowed, backing away into the shadows of a pillar. His eyes, however, were sharp. He wasn't just serving drinks, he was mapping the room. He noted the placement of the new emitter arrays, the patrol routes of the heavy guard units, and the location of the main power junctions. Nearby, a group of aristocrats were lounging on floating divans, laughing as they watched a holographic display of the captured humans being unloaded from a transport. They really are quite adorable when they struggle. A female noble with skin like polished onyx tittered. Look at them. So much wasted energy, like pests trying to outrun a storm. Her companion, a bloatworm in a suspensor harness, jiggled with amusement. It is a mercy, really. We are giving them structure. Without us, they would just scurry around and breed. Eli stood behind them, refilling their glasses. As the bloatworm leaned forward to laugh, Eli subtly shifted his stance. He puffed out his cheeks, mimicked the noble's slouch, and wiggled his fingers in a grotesque parody of the creature's feeding tentacles. Across the room, Syssix, the reptilian servant, caught the gesture. Syssix's eyes went wide, and he let out a sharp, choked sound, violently suppressing a laugh. He had to dive behind a fern to compose himself. Eli's face returned to a mask of blank obedience instantly. He poured the nectar, bowed, and vanished back into the crowd. While Eli played the ghost, Anera played the queen. She stood beside Lord Kale at the entrance to the great hall, a vision of icy perfection. She wore a gown of structural light that shifted from diamond white to steel gray, a visual representation of power and purity. Her smile was flawless, her courtesies practiced, but underneath the silk and light, she was running a rebellion. As she greeted a sector governor, her hand brushed against a concealed panel on her wrist. She wasn't adjusting her jewelry. She was deactivating the thermal sensors in the West Wing ventilation shafts. "You look radiant, my dear," Kyle murmured, his hand resting heavy on the small of her back. His touch was possessive, a reminder of who held the title. "Thank you." "My lord," Anera replied, her voice smooth. "I have arranged for a special art performance before the demonstration. a traditional dance of the nebulas. It will require the main house lights to be dimmed by 40% for dramatic effect. Kyle frowned slightly. Dimmed? Is that wise with the security protocols? It is aesthetic, Anera said, touching his arm gently. The council appreciates culture, do they not? We do not want them to think we are merely brutes with big machines. We must show them we are civilized. Kale considered this. His ego stroked. Very well, but keep it brief. The crowd is hungry for the main event. Anera smiled. A cold, sharp thing. Oh, I promise you it will be memorable. As she turned to greet the next guest, she sent a command through her neural link. It was a direct encrypted burst to Eli's collar. West Junction clear for 3 minutes. Trust your hands. Trust your heart. I am with you. Eli felt the message vibrate against his skin, not a shock, but a caress. A ghost of a touch in the middle of the lion's den. He checked his surroundings, saw the gap in the patrol, and slipped into the maintenance corridor. The understructure of the Great Hall was a tangle of high-voltage cables and cooling ducts. Eli worked fast. He didn't have his toolkit, just the stolen components he had jury-rigged into disruptors. He reached the primary coupling for the neural harmonization machine. It was a massive, shielded conduit humming with lethal power. Eli pulled a small, jagged device from his boot. It looked like junk, scavenged wires and a battery cell, but it was designed to create a harmonic feedback loop. Once activated, it wouldn't just shut the machine down, it would scream back down the line and blow the emitters. He wired it in, his fingers moving with the muscle memory of a lifetime spent fixing broken things. One down, he whispered. He moved to the next junction. This one controlled the broadcast feeds. If they wanted the galaxy to see the demonstration. Eli was going to make sure they saw the truth. He spliced a data shunt into the fiber optic line, bypassing the palace sensors. He was sweating. The air in the conduit was hot and stale. He wiped his brow and checked the time. 2 minutes gone. He scrambled back toward the access hatch. He was almost there when the comms unit on his belt, stolen from a guard, crackled. Sweep Sector 7. Lord Vile reports a fluctuation in the power grid. Eli froze. Sector 7 was the corridor right outside his hatch. He couldn't go out the way he came in. He looked around frantically. There was only one other exit, a service vent that led up into the private administrative wing. He didn't have a choice. He pulled himself up into the vent and crawled. Anera was in her private receiving chamber, supposedly touching up her makeup. In reality, she was monitoring Eli's vitals on a hidden screen. His heart rate was spiking. The door chimed before she could answer. Kale walked in. He didn't look like a husband. He looked like an inquisitor. He dismissed her attendants with a wave of his hand and locked the door behind them. You seem restless. Anera, Kale said, walking slowly around the room. I am anxious for your success, Anera lied, turning to face him. This is a big night for our house. Is it? Kyle stopped in front of her. He reached out and touched the bioluminescent markings on her cheek. His fingers were cold. You have been spending a lot of time in the greenhouse lately, and your personal logs show a significant amount of data traffic. Anera didn't flinch. I am redesigning the irrigation protocols, and the data traffic is for the gala preparations. You said you wanted everything perfect. Kale stared at her, his eyes drilling into hers. He suspected something. He didn't know what, but the predator in him smelled blood. Be careful, my love, he whispered, his voice dropping to a menacing purr. The council is watching. If there is a glitch tonight, if there is any sign of disloyalty, It will not just be you who suffers. He leaned in close. I will liquidate your staff. I will burn your dowry worlds. And that pet human you seem so fond of? I will put him in the chair myself and turn his brain into soup while you watch. Do you understand? Anera's knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of her vanity table. She forced her breathing to remain steady. I understand, she said. Good. Kale patted her cheek, a patronizing slap. Now, finish your face. You look pale. He turned and left. Anera waited until the door closed, then let out a shuddering breath. She looked at her hands. They were shaking. She clenched them into fists. Not yet, she told herself. Do not break yet. Eli emerged from the vent into a deserted corridor in the admin wing. He needed to get back to the service elevators before he was missed. He hurried down the hall, turning a corner and nearly collided with Anera. She was rushing from her chambers, heading back to the hall. They both stopped, inches apart. Eli, she breathed, relief washing over her face. You are safe. I planted the devices, Eli whispered, checking the hallway behind him. The broadcast is rigged. When you give the signal, the whole empire sees the man behind the curtain. Anera looked at him. The fear and the adrenaline were too much. She reached out and grabbed the lapels of his livery. Be careful, she whispered fiercely. Kale knows. He suspect. Let him suspect, Eli said. In 2 hours, he is finished. He looked at her mouth. The danger of the moment stripped away the last of their caution. He leaned in, and she met him halfway. It was a quick, fierce kiss, a collision of lips that tasted of panic and promise. It was a stolen second of courage in a house built on fear. Then, the world ended. Well, a voice drawled from the end of the corridor. I knew the help was incompetent, but I did not know they were ambitious. They broke apart. Kyle stood 10 feet away, flanked by 2 Praetorian guards. His face was a mask of absolute, icy rage. Eli froze, his heart stopped. Anera didn't hesitate, and she didn't think. She reacted with the ruthless instinct of a woman who had survived a monster for years. She shoved Eli backward, hard. Get off me, she screamed, her voice shrill with fake panic. She slapped him. It wasn't a stage slap. It was real. Her hand connected with Eli's cheek with a cracking force that snapped his head to the side. The sting was blinding. How dare you? Anera shouted, backing away, clutching her chest. You filth! You dared to touch me! Eli staggered back, holding his cheek. He looked at her. For a split second, he saw the anguish in her eyes, the silent plea. Play the part. Please, play the part. He understood. If Kale thought they were lovers, they were both dead. If Kale thought Eli had assaulted her, Eli would be punished, but Anera and the mission might survive. My lady. Eli stammered, dropping to his knees. Kale walked forward. He didn't look at Anera. He looked at Eli. He touched you? Kale asked, his voice quiet. He grabbed me. Anera gasped, forcing tears into her eyes. He cornered me. I think he is drunk on the nectar. Kale looked down at Eli. He didn't shout. He simply tapped a code into his wrist comm. Maximum discipline, Kale said. The collar around Eli's neck flared white-hot. It wasn't the anxiety hum. It wasn't the warning shock. It was the full, level 10 agony sequence. Eli didn't scream. He couldn't. His back arched, every muscle in his body locking up as liquid fire poured through his nervous system. He collapsed onto the floor, convulsing, his vision going white. Stop! Anera cried out, instinctively stepping forward. Kyle held up a hand, stopping her. Watch, he commanded. This is what happens when property forgets its place. Anera froze. She had to watch. She had to stand there, in her gown of light, and watch the man she loved writhe on the floor because of a lie she told. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood. She kept her face blank, a mask of offended nobility, while inside, she was screaming. After 10 seconds, an eternity, Kale deactivated the signal. Eli went limp, gasping for air, sweat soaking his livery. "Take him to the Great Hall," Kale ordered the guards. "We need some entertainment before the main event." "And Anera?" She looked at him, her eyes burning. "Yes, my lord. You will administer the apology, publicly. It will be a good lesson for the other guests." The Great Hall was a sea of faces. Thousands of eyes watched as Eli was dragged onto the raised dais. He couldn't stand. His legs were jelly. The guards threw him down, and he landed on his hands and knees. The crowd murmured, a sound like ocean waves. Kale stood at the microphone. "My esteemed guests," he boomed, "we speak of harmony, but harmony requires order. Even in the finest houses, weeds can grow. This creature, this human, dared to lay hands on Lady Vale." A ripple of shock and titillation went through the crowd. Scandal, drama. They loved it. Kyle turned to Anera. She stood beside him, pale as a ghost. He handed her a control tablet. "Make him apologize, my dear, and make him mean it." Anera took the tablet. Her hands were trembling, but she hid it by gripping the device until her knuckles turned white. She looked down at Eli. He was on his knees, head bowed, breathing in ragged gasps. He looked small, broken. She accessed the collar controls. "I am sorry," she mouthed, though no one but Eli could see. "I am so sorry." She tapped the screen. On the large holographic display above the stage, the pain intensity bar shot up to 80%. The crowd gasped in anticipation, but Anera's fingers flew across the sub-menus. She was using the backdoor code Eli had installed weeks ago. She decoupled the display from the actual output. The screen showed 80%. The collar output was set to 5%. Eli braced himself, expecting to die. The collar buzzed. It stung, sharp and unpleasant. But it wasn't the agony of the corridor, it was bearable. He realized instantly what she was doing, and she was faking it. He had to sell it. Eli threw his head back and let out a guttural cry of pain. He collapsed forward, clawing at the floor, shaking his body as if he were being electrocuted. The nobles cheered. They laughed, clapping their hands. "Apologize," Kale shouted. Eli gasped, pulling himself up on one arm. He looked at Anera. He saw the tears standing in her eyes, trapped behind the wall of her resolve. "I apologize," Eli screamed, his voice cracking. "I am dirt. I am nothing. Forgive me, my lady." Anera tapped the screen again. "Ending the punishment. Accepted," she whispered into the microphone, her voice hollow. "Get him out of here," Kyle sneered. "Put him with the other test subjects. He can be the first in the chair tonight." The guards hauled Eli up and dragged him away. As he was pulled through the doors, he locked eyes with Anera one last time. She looked like she was dying. The holding pen for the test subjects was a cage of transparent aluminum located just off the main stage. Eli was thrown inside. He landed hard, skidding across the floor. "Eli!" Hands grabbed him. He looked up. It was a woman from his colony, Sarah, and behind her, his heart shattered, sitting in the corner clutching a dirty stuffed rabbit, was a boy, Leo. He was 8 years old. He used to chase Eli's repair rover, begging for spare copper wire to make bracelets. "Leo," Eli whispered. The boy looked up, his eyes huge and terrified. "Eli? Are they going to hurt us?" Eli scrambled over and pulled the boy into a hug. He felt the small, trembling frame against his chest. No, Eli lied, his voice fierce. No, Leo, they are not going to hurt you, I promise. He looked around the cage. There were 20 of them. 20 people from his home, brought here to be erased for the amusement of monsters. He looked through the transparent wall at the stage. The neural machine was being primed. The hum was getting louder. A vibration on his wrist. He still had the stolen comm unit. Council observers have added a secondary encryption layer. A voice whispered. The rebel contact. We cannot trigger the disruptors remotely. The signal is jammed. Eli cursed. Someone has to be at the console, the voice continued. Manual override. But the console is on the stage. Eli looked at the stage. It was swarming with guards. I can't get there, Eli whispered back. I'm locked in the pen. Anera is on the stage, the voice said. Eli looked up. Anera was taking her seat next to Kale, right beside the control console. The hour before the demonstration was a blur of terror. The guards left the holding pen to take their positions. The door was mag-locked, but there was a service hatch in the floor, too small for a guard, but big enough for a mechanic who knew the layout. Eli had one chance to talk to her before the end. He managed to pry the floor grate open using a metal buckle from his livery. He dropped into the maintenance crawl space. It ran directly under the stage. He crawled until he reached the grate beneath the VIP viewing box. He tapped a rhythm on the metal. Above him, Anera heard it. She excused herself, claiming she needed to compose herself after the incident. She slipped into the private washroom that connected to the service corridor. Eli pushed the grate up and climbed into the small, dark hallway. Anera was there. She looked wrecked. The perfect hostess mask was gone. Her face was streaked with tears, her breathing shallow. When she saw him, she didn't speak. She launched herself at him. She buried her face in his neck, sobbing. I hurt you, she gasped. I hurt you, I'm sorry. I didn't know what else to do. Eli held her. He was still sore, his nerves jangling from the corridor shock, but he held her tight. You did what you had to do, he whispered into her hair. You saved the mission. I hated it, she cried, clutching his back. I hated every second. I wanted to scream. I wanted to burn the whole hall down, seeing you on your knees, hearing them laugh. He pulled back and cupped her face. Her bioluminescence was dim, flickering like a dying bulb. Anera, listen to me. That wasn't me on that floor. That was a role. The real me is standing right here, and I know who you are. He wiped a tear from her cheek. You are the woman who lowered the pain. You are the woman who saved my life. Anera looked at him, her eyes searching his. I love you, she whispered. The words hung in the dark, heavy and absolute. I would rather bear your hatred than see you die, but I love you. I love you too, Eli said. They clung to each other in the dim light. It wasn't about sex. It was about survival. It was about feeling the other person's heartbeat to prove that they were still human, still alive, still capable of feeling something other than fear. He ran his hands down her back, memorizing the feel of the living silk. She gripped his arms, her fingers digging into his skin, grounding herself. We have to finish this, Eli said softly. I know. Anera sniffed, pulling back. The rebels told me. The remote trigger is down. I need you to hit the manual override, Eli said. When the machine powers up, when the hum hits the peak frequency, you have to jam the sequence. It is right next to Kale, Anera said, her voice trembling. He will see me. He will see you, Eli admitted. And once you do it, there is no going back. House Vile falls. You become a traitor. Anera straightened her spine. She smoothed her gown. The light on her skin flared. turning from a dim gray to a fierce burning silver. "Let it fall," she said. "I am done building cages." She kissed him, one last lingering press of lips. "If we survive this," she whispered, "we rewrite the rules. No collars, no owners, just us, Eli promised. She turned and walked back toward the stage. Eli watched her go, then dropped back into the crawl space. The demonstration began with a fanfare of trumpets. The lights in the great hall dimmed. The art performance Anera had scheduled began. Dancers moving in glowing suits, swirling like nebulas. It was beautiful and distracting. Under the cover of the darkness and the music, Eli crawled back to the holding pen. He slipped up through the grate. Leo was waiting for him. "Are we safe?" the boy asked. Eli looked at the stage. The neural machine was glowing a sickly green. Kyle was standing at the podium, smiling like a shark. Anera sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead. "Not yet," Eli whispered. "But we are about to make a lot of noise." He moved to the back of the pen, where the main power conduit for the cage lock ran. He began to work on the panel, stripping wires with his teeth. On the stage, the dancers finished. The lights came up, harsh and bright. "Bring out the first subject," Cale commanded. 2 guards approached the holding pen. Eli connected the last wire. He looked at the stage. He saw Anera look at him. She gave a microscopic nod. Eli whispered to the room, to the boy, to the woman he loved. For everyone they broke. He shorted the lock. Sparks showered down. The door to the pen hissed open. At the same moment, on the stage, the neural machine began its high-pitched whine. Cale turned to the crowd, arms spread. "Behold, the sound of peace." Anera reached out. She didn't look at Cale. She looked at the mirror-black surface of the console. She saw her reflection. She didn't see a lady. She didn't see a victim. She saw a rebel. She slammed her hand down on the override key. The air in the great hall was so thick with tension it felt like ozone before a storm. The elite of the galaxy sat in their floating observation pods, sipping nectar and watching the stage with the bored detachment of gods. Below them, the holding pen door hissed open, but the guards were still shoving the humans forward, forcing them toward the chairs. Leo, the boy from Eli's colony, stumbled, clutching his stuffed rabbit. Lord Cale stepped up to the podium. He looked magnificent, his armor polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the thousands of expectant faces. "My friends," he boomed, his voice amplified to fill the cavernous space. "For centuries, we have fought against the chaos of biological will, war, rebellion, dissent. These are the symptoms of a disorganized mind." He gestured to the terrified humans. "Tonight, we offer the cure. Tonight, we do not just enslave the body, we harmonize the soul. We offer these primitives the gift of perfect purpose." The crowd applauded politely. Anera stood beside him. She was a statue of ice, her hands clasped in front of her. Her bioluminescence was dim, almost extinguished. But inside, her mind was a ticking clock. 3, 2, 1. Eli, crouched in the shadows behind the pen, hit the enter key on his stolen datapad. The world turned white. The neural harmonization machine didn't just turn on, it screamed. The feedback loop Eli had installed slammed into the emitter array with the force of a tidal wave. The green light turned a blinding, violent violet. Sparks the size of fists rained down on the stage. The massive holographic screens that had been displaying the House Vial logo flickered and died. Then, they rebooted. But they weren't showing the logo anymore. They were showing the footage from the lab, the man in the chair, the empty eyes, the soul-destroying wail. Then, audio cut in, Cale's voice, recorded from his private study. Burn them out if you have to. I do not care if they drool, as long as they obey. The great hall went dead silent. Then, chaos erupted. The machine on stage exploded, not a fiery explosion, but a concussive blast of energy that blew the podium apart and sent Kale stumbling backward. Now, Anera shouted, dropping the mask. She didn't run for cover. She ran for the control console. Her fingers flew across the keys, unlocking the broadcast array. The footage wasn't just playing in the hall. It was beaming out to the city, to the orbital stations, to the relay buoys in deep space. Kyle scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of fury. "Cut the feed!" he screamed at his guards. "Kill them! Kill them all!" But the palace wasn't listening. Security breach. The AI boomed, its voice distorted and warping. Anomalous data detected. Initiating Protocol Omega. Huge blast doors began to slam down over the exits. The lights flickered from white to emergency red. Eli sprinted from the shadows. "Run!" he shouted to the humans in the pen. "Get to the service tunnels!" He grabbed Leo and shoved him toward Sarah. "Go!" The guards were confused, their comms jammed by the static of the overloading machine. Eli didn't wait. He grabbed a stun baton dropped by a stunned guard and swung it wildly, cracking another guard across the helmet. Anera was fighting too. A Praetorian guard lunged for her, reaching for her throat. She didn't flinch. She sidestepped, grabbed his wrist, and used his own momentum to flip him over the console. She slammed her palm onto his chest plate, entering a command code that froze his armor's servos. She looked up and saw Eli across the stage. "Go!" she screamed. "The East Wing! They ran!" The palace was tearing itself apart. The gravity generators were fluctuating, causing the waterfalls outside to crash down in unpredictable torrents. The floor tilted. Eli and Anera sprinted down the main corridor, surrounded by a stampede of fleeing slaves. Syssix, the reptilian servant, was running alongside them. In the madness, he had snatched a ludicrously large feathered hat from a fainting noblewoman and jammed it onto his scaled head. "If we are going to die," Syssix shouted over the alarms. "I am walking out in style." Eli would have laughed if he wasn't terrified. They reached the junction to the East Wing. A containment field slammed down, cutting them off from Syssix and the others. Eli and Anera were alone. They skidded to a halt. The corridor behind them was filling with smoke. The path ahead was blocked by a squad of security drones. Target acquired. The drones chirped. "Assets are corrupted. Terminate." Eli pulled Anera into a side room, the wreckage of a small gallery. The ceiling was groaning, cracks spiderwebbing across the obsidian. "We're trapped," Eli gasped, leaning against a crumbling pillar. Anera looked at him. Her dress was torn, her hair wild, her face streaked with soot. She looked more beautiful than he had ever seen her. The drones were cutting through the door. Sparks flew as the laser slicers worked. Eli looked at the door, then at Anera. The reality of it hit him. This was probably it. He laughed. It was a dry, broken sound. "What?" Anera asked, breathless. Eli shook his head, looking at the ceiling. "I was just thinking. I was enslaved by an alien family, and I spent weeks scrubbing floors and dodging nerve whips. And somehow I fell in love with my captor's wife." He looked at her, his eyes fierce and bright in the gloom. "And I would do it all again. Anera, every second, every scar. If it meant standing here with you now." Anera let out a sob that was half laugh. Tears were streaming down her face, glowing with the bioluminescence of her skin. "I love you," she whispered. "Not as a slave, not as a mechanic, as a man, as Eli." She grabbed his face. "I would lose everything for this," she said. "I would burn this whole empire down just to hold your hand for 1 minute." The door blew inward with a crash. They didn't look at the drones. They looked at each other. They kissed. It was desperate, passionate, a collision of souls at the end of the world. It tasted of smoke and tears and defiance. Then, Eli pulled back. His eyes went to the data port on the wall. "Not yet," he snarled. He pulled the stolen data module from his pocket. It was the one he had used to record the harmonization scream. "Cover me," he shouted. He dove for the port. Anera spun around. She didn't have a weapon. She ripped a heavy metal pipe from the broken wall. The first drone flew in. Anera swung the pipe like a bat, smashing it out of the air. Eli jammed the module into the port. "Listen to this," he screamed at the AI. He uploaded the file, not the virus, the scream, the raw, unfiltered audio of a human soul being erased. He tagged it with a high-priority system query. "Does this comply with core directive? Protect life?" The AI paused. The drones froze in midair. "Processing," the voice boomed. "Input data analysis. Extreme distress. Contradiction detected." The AI had been programmed to harmonize life, to create order. But the raw data of the scream was pure chaos, pure suffering. It was a logical paradox. Anera stepped forward, her voice ringing with command authority. "System, pause and review. All lethal protocols are suspended pending ethical audit. Authorization vial Alpha 1. The AI word. Pause acknowledged. Initiating system-wide review. Broadcasting evidence to central authority for judgment." The red lights turned to a cautious yellow. The drones powered down and hovered, harmless. "We did it," Eli breathed, slumping against the wall. The floor shook. "Not quite," a voice said. The wall behind them blasted inward. Kyle stepped through the dust. He looked insane. His armor was scorched, his cape gone. He held a disruptor rifle in one hand, but he wasn't aiming it. He was looking at Anera with a mix of hatred and confusion. "Why?" he rasped. "You had everything. We were gods." "You were a butcher," Anera said, stepping in front of Eli. "And I was your trophy," Kale laughed. It was a glitching, mechanical sound. "Butcher? You think I chose this? You think I wanted this?" He tapped the side of his head. "The Council of Algorithms. Anera. The AI. They decided biological free will was inefficient centuries ago. They just needed a face to sell the cure." Anera froze. "What?" "I am just a processor," Kale sneered. "I have an implant in my cortex. It nudges me. It suggests things. Efficiency. Order. You are fighting a math equation, my dear, and you cannot kill math." He raised the rifle. "But I can kill the variables." He fired. Anera moved. She didn't dive for cover. She dove for Eli. The blast caught her shoulder, spinning her around. She cried out and fell. "No!" Eli roared. He didn't think. He didn't plan. He launched himself at Kale. He wasn't a soldier. Kale was a trained warrior in powered armor. Kale backhanded him, sending Eli skidding across the floor. But Eli was a mechanic. He knew how machines worked, and he knew Kale was standing on a power junction. Kale leveled the rifle at Eli's head. "Goodbye, asset." Eli grabbed a loose power cable from the exposed floor panel. "Harmonize this," he spat. He jammed the live cable into the conductive floor plate Kale was standing on. Blue lightning arced up Kale's legs. The armor acted as a conductor. Kale screamed, his body seizing. The rifle fired into the ceiling. The surge blew out the implant in his head. Kale collapsed, twitching, smoke rising from his ears. Eli scrambled over to Anera. She was clutching her shoulder, her dress stained with glowing blue blood. "Anera, I am okay," she gasped, wincing. "It grazed me." She looked at Kyle. He was lying on the floor, groaning. He was alive, but his eyes were unfocused, stripped of the cold intelligence that had defined him. Eli picked up the rifle. He aimed it at Cale's head. "Do it," he whispered to himself. "No," Anera said. She put her hand on the barrel and pushed it down. "He must live," she said, her voice hard. "If we kill him, he becomes a martyr for the council. If he lives, he becomes evidence. He must answer for what he did, and so must I." The sound of heavy thrusters filled the air. Through the shattered wall, they saw dropships descending. Not House Vale ships, Imperial Authority ships. The broadcast had worked. The galaxy had seen the truth. Within minutes, troops in white armor swarmed the room. They weren't there to save anyone. They were there to contain the mess. "Drop the weapon!" a commander shouted. Eli dropped the rifle. He raised his hands. Anera stood up, leaning heavily on Eli. She held her head high. "I am Lady Anera Vale," she announced. "I surrender myself to the custody of the High Court." The commander looked at her, then at Eli. "Secure the noble," he ordered. "Process the human as evidence." Two soldiers grabbed Eli. "No!" Anera shouted, trying to reach for him. "He is not evidence. He is a person. He is property of House Vale," the commander said coldly. "Until the legal status of the house is resolved, he is an asset in a criminal investigation. Take him away." Eli didn't fight. He looked at Anera as they dragged him back. "I'm here," he shouted, "and I'm still here. I will find you." Anera screamed, tears streaming down her face as the soldiers restrained her. "I will testify. I will tell them everything." They were pulled apart. Eli was shoved into a containment transport. The last thing he saw was Anera, bleeding and broken, standing amidst the ruins of her life, fighting not for her title but for him. The doors slammed shut. Eli sat in the dark. He touched the spot on his neck where the collar used to be. It was gone. He smiled. "Let them put me in a cell," he thought. "I know who I am now." And he knew she was out there, fighting for him. The story wasn't over. The chains were broken. Now, they just had to survive the freedom. The tribunal of the Galactic Core was not a courtroom. It was a coliseum of judgment, floating in the vacuum of a neutral star system. The station was a massive ring of glass and white durasteel, designed to make the accused feel small and the law feel infinite. Inside the central chamber, thousands of delegates from 100 worlds sat in tiered rows that stretched up into the shadows of the domed ceiling. In the center of the floor, suspended on a gravity disk, stood the defendants. Lord Cale Vile sat slumped in a containment field, without his armor, without the neural implant that had regulated his serotonin and ambition. He looked like a deflated balloon. He was twitching, his eyes darting around the room, muttering about efficiency metrics that no longer existed. Beside him, separated by a heavy barrier of silence, sat Anera. She wore no living silk. She wore a prisoner's uniform, a simple, rough-woven tunic of uncolored gray. Her hair, once a floating halo of silver, hung limp around her shoulders. Her bioluminescence was dim, a faint ghostly pulse that barely registered against the harsh white lights of the chamber. But she sat with her back straight. She did not look at the floor. She looked at the massive holographic screens that dominated the room. On those screens, the galaxy was watching the evidence. They saw the footage from the lab. They heard the scream of the human soul being erased. They saw Eli, dirty and desperate, hacking the console. They saw the luxury of the Vile Palace contrasted with the squalor of the slave pens. It was a dissection of an empire's conscience, broadcast live to 300 billion sentient beings. While the galaxy debated philosophy, Eli was debating the rules of a card game. He was being held in a detention block on the lower levels of the station. Technically, he was a material witness. Practically, He was still locked up until the bureaucrats figured out if he was a person or a piece of evidence. He sat on the floor of a communal cell, surrounded by a motley crew of former slaves who had been scooped up in the raid. There was Sissix, the reptilian servant who had stolen the hat, a four-armed heavy lifter named Vrax, and two other humans from the colony. "Got any threes?" Eli asked, tapping a deck of cards he had fashioned out of flattened ration wrappers and marked with charcoal. Sissix blinked his inner eyelids. "I do not understand this game." "Eli, why is the goal to collect the fish? We are in space. There are no fish. It is a metaphor." "Sissix," Eli said, grinning. "It is about patience and lying. Mostly lying. Go fish." Vrax grunted, throwing a wrapper down. "I prefer the game where we hit things." "We are done hitting things," Eli said, his voice turning serious for a moment. "That is the point. We are just waiting for the suits upstairs to catch up with the program." The door to the cell buzzed. A bailiff, a tall android with a gleaming chrome face, stepped in. "Asset 734, also known as Eli of Hestia Prime. Your presence is required in the primary chamber." Eli stood up. He dusted off his jumpsuit, cleaner than his mechanic's gear, but still standard-issue prison wear. He looked at Sissix. "Don't cheat while I am gone." Sissix hissed a laugh. "I make no promises, human. Give them hell." The transition from the cell to the courtroom was blinding. Eli blinked against the glare as the lift deposited him on the witness platform. He felt exposed, a speck of dust under a microscope. He looked across the vast circular floor. He saw Kale, who looked through him as if he were transparent. Then he saw Anera. She turned her head. When her eyes met his, her breath hitched visibly. She looked terrified, not for herself, but for him. She offered him a tiny, trembling nod, a silent apology, a silent hello. Eli nodded back. He wanted to run to her, to pull her out of that gray tunic, but he was rooted to the spot by the gaze of the High Inquisitor. The Inquisitor was a terrifyingly old being, a creature of floating robes and cybernetic enhancements who hovered in the center of the room. "State your name," the Inquisitor boomed. "Eli," he said, his voice cracking slightly before he found his strength. "Just Eli." "You were the property of House Vale?" "I was a mechanic," Eli corrected. "Then I was a captive. I was never property. I just wore their collar." A murmur went through the assembly. "Tell us," the Inquisitor commanded. "Tell us of the treatment, the cruelty, the mind control." Eli gripped the railing of the platform. He looked at the cameras. "You want to hear about the torture," he began. "You saw the tapes. You heard the screams. You know about the nerve whips and the harmonization beams. That is the big stuff. That is the stuff that makes the news." He paused, looking over at the noble delegates in their velvet boxes. "But that is not what breaks you. What breaks you is the quiet. It is standing in a room full of people who talk about you like you are a lamp. It is the way they laugh at dinner while you pour the wine, knowing your life is worth less than the liquid in the glass. It is the absurdity of it." He gestured toward Kale. "Lord Vile used to give speeches about galactic order, and then he would go home and yell at a servant because his soup was 2 degrees too cold. That is the reality of slavery. It is not just evil. It is stupid. It is petty men playing God because they are afraid of being small." He took a breath. "But we found ways to live. We made jokes in the dark. We shared food. We remembered our names. You can chain a body, but you cannot chain a sense of humor. And you cannot harmonize the part of a soul that knows it is free." The Inquisitor leaned forward. "The records state you had a close relationship with the co-conspirator. Lady Anera Vile. Was this relationship coerced? Did she use her command codes to force your compliance? Eli looked at Anera. She was staring at her hands, bracing herself for his answer. She expected him to save himself. She expected him to say yes, to paint her as the villain so he could walk away clean. No, Eli said clearly. The room went silent. It started with coercion. Eli said, "She owned me, that is a fact. But she was the one who lowered the pain. She was the one who gave me the device to break the leash. She gave me a choice." He looked directly at Anera. "I fell in love with her," Eli announced to the galaxy. The shock in the room was palpable. A distinct gasp rippled through the tears. A slave falling in love with a master was scandalous. Admitting it in court was insanity. "I loved her," Eli continued, his voice rising. "And that is the most messed up part of this whole thing. Because how can you really love someone when they hold the remote control to your nervous system? We had to fight through layers of power and fear just to find a scrap of something real. That is what systems like this do. They do not just hurt bodies. They twist love. They make trust impossible." He looked back at the Inquisitor. "Love cannot be real unless both people are free to walk away. We learned that the hard way. I am here today because I chose to be. And she is there." He pointed at Anera, "because she chose to destroy her own life to save mine. If that is not evidence of her character, I do not know what is." Anera had her hand over her mouth, tears sliding down her face, dripping onto the gray wool of her lap. When it was Anera's turn to speak, the mood in the chamber shifted. She did not plead for mercy. She did not cry. She stood up, looking small in the center of the vast floor, and spoke with a clarity that cut through the noise. "I am guilty," she said. Her voice was amplified, carrying to the furthest rows. "I enjoyed the silk. I ate the food grown by stolen hands. I walked through hallways polished by people who were dying of exhaustion, and I looked away because it was easier than looking at them." She looked at Kale, who was rocking back and forth in his field. "I told myself I was a victim too. I told myself my marriage was a cage. And it was. But it was a gilded cage. I had a key. Eli. And the others? They did not." She turned to the judges. "You ask about the Council of Algorithms. Yes, they exist. They are an ancient logic grid deep in the core. Machines that decided thousands of years ago that free will is a variable that creates chaos. They pushed the harmonization project. They influenced my husband through his implant. But do not blame the machines entirely." She swept her hand across the room, encompassing the nobles. "Machines only suggest. We are the ones who listened. We listened because we wanted to believe that our comfort was worth their pain. We bought the lie because it was profitable." She looked at Eli. He was standing in the witness box, watching her with an intensity that anchored her. "Eli told you that love requires freedom," she said softly. "He is right. Peace also requires freedom. A peace built on forced obedience is not peace. It is stagnation. It is a graveyard where everyone is still breathing." She took a deep breath. "I stripped the codes from the security AI. I exposed the project. I betrayed my house. I did these things not because I am a hero, but because a man in chains made me laugh. He showed me that dignity is not something you are born with. It is something you fight for. If a slave can find the courage to save the empire that crushed him, then the least I can do is accept the consequences of my part in it." She sat down. The silence that followed was absolute. The deliberation took 3 days. When the tribunal returned, the verdict reshaped the galaxy. The High Inquisitor read the judgment. The Neural Harmonization Project is hereby declared a crime against sapience. The Council of Algorithms is to be located and dismantled immediately. All code derived from their logic is banned. A cheer went up from the gallery, wild and raucous. Regarding the institution of indentured servitude and sentient ownership, the Inquisitor continued, raising a hand for silence. The tribunal orders an immediate moratorium. A 10-year plan for total dismantling and emancipation is effective today. Slavery is dead. The cheer this time was deafening. Eli closed his eyes and let out a breath he felt like he had been holding since the day he was captured in the tunnel. Regarding Lord Kael Viel, found guilty of treason, torture, and crimes against life, sentenced to lifelong confinement in a rehabilitation facility. Regarding Lady Anera Viel, the room quieted. Found guilty of complicity and possession of sentient beings. However, in light of her critical role in exposing the conspiracy and preventing the planetary harmonization, execution is taken off the table. Eli gripped the railing. Lady Viel is stripped of all titles, lands, and assets. She is sentenced to 20 years of mandatory community service, to be served in the reconstruction zones of the Outer Rim. She is to be released from custody immediately to begin her sentence. Regarding the witness, Eli, you are granted full legal personhood. House Vale is liquidated, and a portion of its assets will be distributed as reparations to you and your fellow survivors. You are free to go. The courtyard of the tribunal complex was a stark, geometric garden of white stone and alien moss. The air was thin and smelled of recycled oxygen, but it was fresh. Eli sat on a bench staring at the artificial sun overhead. He wore civilian clothes now, a simple jacket and trousers provided by the court. He held a cup of coffee that tasted like burnt rubber, but he didn't care. He heard footsteps. Anera walked into the courtyard. She was carrying a small bag. She was still in the gray tunic, but without the containment field around her. She looked different. She looked real. She stopped a few feet away from him. She looked uncertain, stripped of the armor of her nobility. She didn't know how to be Anera without the lady attached to it. "Hi," Eli said, standing up. "Hi," she whispered. They stood there, awkward strangers with a lifetime of trauma between them. "You were incredible in there," Eli said. "I was honest," Anera replied, for the first time. She looked down at her bag. "I am being deployed to Sector 6. There is a terraforming project that needs administrators. It is hard work. They say mud, radiation. Sounds terrible." Eli smiled. "You will hate it." Anera looked up, and a small, fragile smile touched her lips. "I probably will, but I deserve it." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "And you? Where will you go? You have money now. You can go anywhere. The core worlds, the pleasure domes." Eli shrugged. "I was thinking of going back to Hestia Prime. The colony is a wreck, but it is home. Someone needs to fix the comms beacon so the next time the Empire shows up, we can see them coming." Anera nodded. "That sounds like you." She shifted her weight. "Eli," she said, her voice trembling. "About what you said. On the stand. About loving me." "I meant it," Eli said quickly. "I know." Anera said, "I love you too. You know that. But..." She stepped closer, her silver eyes intense. "We are a mess, Eli. You were my slave. I was your master. That does not just go away because a judge banged a gavel. I need to figure out who I am when I am not owning people. And you need to figure out who you are when you are not surviving me." Eli looked at her. He wanted to argue. He wanted to grab her and say it didn't matter. But he knew she was right. The dynamic was twisted, If they started now, they would always be looking for the leash. So, what? Eli asked, his throat tight. We just say goodbye? No, Anera said. She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were rougher than he remembered, no dermal knitters to smooth away the stress. We say, see you later. I have 20 years of service. Hestia Prime is in Sector 6, isn't it? Eli grinned. It is. Just a short hop from the terraforming project. Then maybe, Anera said, stepping into his space, maybe a repair shop on Hestia Prime will need a visitor sometimes. Someone who needs her datapad fixed, or someone who just wants to hear a bad joke. Eli looked at their joined hands. No cuffs, no collars, just skin against skin. I think that could be arranged, he said softly. Anera leaned up. She didn't rush. She didn't look over her shoulder for Kyle. She pressed her lips to his. It was a gentle kiss. It wasn't fueled by adrenaline or terror. It was calm. It tasted of hope and the terrible, wonderful weight of freedom. When she pulled back, her forehead rested against his. Thank you, she whispered, for saving me. Thank you, Eli replied, for setting me free. He let go of her hand. Now go, he said, before I change my mind and try to smuggle you into my luggage. Anera laughed, that real, messy laugh he loved. She wiped her eyes, picked up her bag, and walked toward the transport shuttle. She stopped at the gate and looked back. She didn't wave. She just smiled, a promise across the distance. Eli sat back down on the bench. He took a sip of the terrible coffee. Gross, he muttered, wiping his mouth. I can't wait to show her how bad real human coffee tastes. She is going to be so disappointed. He laughed, and the sound drifted up into the endless open sky. Epilogue. 3 years later, the sunset on Hestia Prime was a bruised purple, streaked with the orange dust of reconstruction. The colony wasn't what it used to be. It was better. The main street was bustling. Humans, aliens, and droids moved together. There were no soldiers. There were no chains. In the center of town stood a building made of salvaged ship parts and local stone. The sign above the door read, Second Chance Repair Logistics. Inside, Eli was buried waist-deep in the engine of a hovering tractor. Pass me the hydro spanner, he grunted. A hand passed him the tool. It was a hand with pale, gray skin and faint, glowing lines running up the wrist. You are holding it upside down, a voice said. Eli slid out from under the engine. He wiped grease from his face and looked up. Anera sat on a stool next to him. She wore work boots and a vest covered in pockets. Her hair was tied back in a messy bun, and there was a smudge of oil on her nose. She looked tired, older, and absolutely radiant. I am holding it with style, Eli retorted, sitting up. How was the council meeting? Anera sighed, handing him a rag. Exhausting. The delegation from the Reptilian Union wants to file a grievance about the noise from the playground. I told them that the sound of children playing is the sound of not being dead, so they should get used to it. Eli laughed. You are getting diplomatic in your old age. I learned from the best. She smiled, leaning forward to wipe a spot of grease from his cheek. She didn't flinch when she touched him. He didn't flinch when she reached out. The flinching had stopped a year ago. They walked out onto the porch of the shop as the sun dipped below the horizon. In the square across the street, a group of children were playing tag. There was a human girl, a reptilian boy, and a small floating gas bag child. They were shrieking and running, tumbling over each other. Leo, now 11 and lanky, was showing them how to throw a frisbee. Anera leaned her head on Eli's shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. We did good, she whispered, watching the kids. Eli looked at the horizon. He didn't see warships. He saw a trade hauler ascending into orbit, carrying grain, not slaves. He thought about the collar. He thought about the tunnel. He thought about the fear that used to live in his marrow. It was gone, replaced by the warmth of the woman beside him and the ache of a hard day's work. Being enslaved had broken him. It had taken his world apart. But in the wreckage, he had found pieces he never knew he had. He had found a voice. He had found a fight. And against every statistical probability in the universe, he had found her. Yeah, Eli said, kissing the top of her head as the stars began to come out. We did good. He squeezed her hand, and she squeezed back. Now, he said, turning her toward the door. I believe it is your turn to cook, and if you try to make that nutrient paste again, I am filing a grievance with the tribunal. Anera laughed, the sound echoing in the twilight, free and clear. I love you too, she said. They went inside, and the door closed on a house that had no locks.